Welcome to Whispering Pages. If you're here tonight, you've already made a quiet decision to end your day feeding your mind rather than numbing it. That matters more than it might seem. Before we get into tonight's book, let's take a moment just for you. You've been in motion all day, and even now, lying still, you might notice the residue of it, the mental hum, the half-finished thoughts, the things you meant to do. You don't have to resolve any of that tonight. Just notice it's there, and let it sit off to the side, the way you'd set something down on a table you're not using. Now turn your attention to your senses, very gently. What sounds are in the room right now? Not distant ones, the sounds right here. The quiet ones. The texture of the silence around you. Notice the weight of your body against the mattress. The warmth under the covers. The way your hands feel resting wherever they are. You don't have to do anything with any of this. Just nod. Ice it. You. Here. Here's something worth knowing as you settle in. The 30 minutes before sleep is one of the most powerful windows for learning that exists in your entire day. As your brain transitions toward rest, it becomes unusually receptive to new ideas, and what you absorb in this window gets consolidated deeply into memory while you sleep. So you're not just winding down. You're learning in the way your brain does best. Tonight we're beginning a two-part journey through one of the most provocative business books of the last 2 decades, The 4-Hour Workweek by Timothy Ferriss, first published in 2007. It spent years on the New York Times bestseller list. It changed how a generation thought about work, time, and what a well-designed life could actually look like. It is audacious, practical, sometimes uncomfortable, and genuinely worth your attention. Tonight, Part 1. We'll cover who Ferriss is, what he's really arguing, and the first 2 phases of his framework, definition and elimination. So get comfortable. Close your eyes if you'd like. And let's whisper through this one together. Timothy Ferriss was not a guru when he wrote this book. He was a burnt-out entrepreneur in his late 20s, running a nutritional supplements company he'd built from scratch, and slowly destroying himself in the process. 14-hour days, 7 days a week, calls at 2 in the morning, the constant low-grade panic of someone who has made their business completely dependent on their own presence. He was successful by most external measures. He was miserable by every internal one. And then, on the edge of collapse, he did something that surprised him. He bought a plane ticket to Europe and left. What happened while he was gone was the seed of everything in this book. His business didn't fall apart. His inbox survived. In some ways, things ran better without him hovering over every decision. And he came back with a question he couldn't shake. What if the structure of how I work is the problem, not how hard I work? He spent the next few years redesigning his life around the answer. He traveled. He competed in international tango championships. He learned languages. He sold his supplements company. He wrote this book. And then he watched it change a lot of lives, not because everyone followed his exact path, but because it gave people permission to ask a question most had never asked seriously. Does my life have to look like this? The title is a deliberate provocation. He's not promising you a 4-hour work week by next Tuesday. What he's doing is using that number to break a deeply held assumption. The assumption that hours and output are proportional. That working more means achieving more. That being busy is the same thing as moving forward. He introduces 2 concepts that carry the entire book's argument. The first is the difference between absolute income and relative income. Most of us think about earnings as a total, an annual salary, a monthly revenue figure. But Ferriss argues that the more honest number is hourly. A consultant earning $200,000 a year while working 80 hours a week is making around $48 per hour. A freelance designer earning $70,000 while working 25 hours a week is making $54 per hour. The designer is richer, not in raw dollars, but in the only currency that determines how life actually feels from the inside: time. The second is the concept of the new rich, his term for people who aren't defined by net worth, but by freedom. They have time and mobility. They're living the life most people are saving up for, while they're still young and curious enough to enjoy it. Not necessarily because they're wealthy in the conventional sense, but because they've deliberately designed their lives around what they actually want, rather than drifting into a default. And then he offers a framework for doing that. He calls it DEAL. 4 letters, 4 phases. D for definition. E for elimination. A for automation. L for liberation. We'll cover the first 2 tonight. Definition begins with the most uncomfortable question in the book: what do you actually want? Not the vague answer, to be happy, to have more time, to feel free. The specific, embarrassing, honest answer. The thing you'd write down if no one would ever read it. Ferriss asks readers to complete what he calls a dreamline. You list the things you want to have, to be, and to do within the next 6 months and the next 12. Then you calculate the monthly cost of each one. Most people discover something surprising. The life they actually want is far more affordable than they imagined. Because the things that would most change how life feels aren't usually things at all. They're experiences, freedoms, flexibilities. And those tend to cost less than the luxury goods we've been trained to substitute for them. He pairs this with a practice called fear setting, a direct counterpart to goal setting. Instead of asking what you want to achieve, you ask, what's the absolute worst that could happen if you made the leap you've been avoiding? Write it down in detail. Then ask, how likely is this outcome, really? And if it did happen, how would you recover? Most people find, when they actually do this exercise, that the worst case is far more survivable than they'd assumed, and that the cost of not acting has been far higher than they've been willing to admit. There's also a thread throughout the definition section about the difference between being productive and being busy. Ferriss is quietly relentless on this point. Busy is filling your hours. Productive is moving something that matters. Most people, he argues, are excellent at the former and almost completely untrained in the latter. They optimize their speed and their systems and their schedules, and never stop to ask whether the thing they're speeding through is worth doing at all. He also introduces a series of small comfort challenges scattered throughout the book. Ask a stranger for their phone number, lie down on the floor of a coffee shop for 10 seconds, negotiate a discount on something that seems non-negotiable. The point isn't the outcome. It's expanding the range of what feels possible, and discovering that most of the social risks we avoid are smaller than we've made them. Once you've defined what you actually want, the second phase begins: elimination. And this is where many readers either fall deeply in love with the book or start pushing back hard. Ferriss builds the elimination section on 2 principles he treats as almost universal laws. The first is the 80-20 principle, named after the Italian economist Vilfredo Pareto, who in 1906 noticed that 80% of Italy's land was owned by 20% of its population, and then found the same ratio appearing everywhere he looked. 80% of a company's revenue tends to come from 20% of its customers. 80% of your meaningful output tends to come from 20% of your activities. 80% of your frustrations tend to come from 20% of your relationships or commitments. The precise numbers vary, but the pattern is remarkably consistent. The practical question Ferriss asks is this: if this is true, what does your 20% actually look like? Which clients produce most of your revenue, and which produce most of your headaches? Which tasks genuinely advance your most important goals, and which just fill your calendar? Most people have never done this analysis on their own lives. When they do, the results tend to be unsettling and clarifying in equal measure. The second principle is Parkinson's law, which states that work expands to fill the time available for its completion. Give yourself a week for a task and it becomes a week-long task. Give yourself an afternoon and it becomes an afternoon task, often with comparable quality. Shorter deadlines don't just force efficiency. They force prioritization. They burn away everything that isn't essential. Together, these two principles form a scalpel. Apply the 80-20 rule to identify what actually matters. Then apply Parkinson's law to create the pressure that makes you do only that. On information, Ferriss recommends what he calls a low-information diet. Most of what we consume, news, social media, ambient browsing, the steady drip of other people's opinions, doesn't improve our decisions or sharpen our thinking. It occupies the mental space where genuine reflection used to live. His suggestion: check email twice a day, at fixed times, with an auto-response letting people know. This single change, he argues, produces more psychological relief than almost any other in the book. Not because email is unimportant, but because constant availability is a factory for interruption, and interruption is the enemy of both deep work and genuine rest. He's similarly skeptical of meetings. If a conversation can be handled by email, it shouldn't be a meeting. If a meeting can be replaced by a 5-minute phone call, it should be. He describes the average meeting as an expensive ritual that generates the feeling of productivity while often producing very little of it. This is uncomfortable to hear if you spend a significant portion of your week in conference rooms. It's also hard to disagree with. He walks through his own experience applying these ideas to his supplements business. He identified the 20% of his customers generating 80% of the revenue. He also identified the 20% generating 80% of his support tickets, his refund requests, and his 2 a.m. phone calls. He fired the difficult ones. He raised his minimum order size to filter out small, high-maintenance buyers. Revenue dipped briefly. Then it recovered. But his stress didn't just decrease, it collapsed. And the time that opened up changed everything about what became possible next. The deeper argument underneath all of this is one that takes some sitting with. We are culturally trained to equate busyness with virtue. Being overwhelmed signals importance. Saying no feels selfish or lazy or like you're not taking things seriously enough. Ferriss argues that this cultural script is not just unhelpful, it's a trap. It keeps capable people doing low-leverage work indefinitely, always too occupied to do the thing that would actually change their situation. He's not suggesting you care less about your work. He's suggesting you care more precisely about the 20% that genuinely matters, and radically less about the other 80% that mostly just generates noise. And here's the thing. Most people who apply even a partial version of elimination don't feel like they're doing less. They feel like they're finally doing something. Because for the first time in a long time, they can actually see the thing they're working toward without a wall of urgent but unimportant tasks blocking the view. That's the gift of elimination. Not laziness. Clarity. It's worth naming what the book gets right in this section before we move on. The 80-20 analysis is genuinely useful, not just as an intellectual exercise, but as a recurring practice. Parkinson's law is one of the most practical productivity insights you'll encounter anywhere. And the low-information diet, as uncomfortable as it sounds, is something that almost everyone who tries it reports some version of relief from. These ideas hold up. In Part 2, we'll move into automation and liberation, virtual assistants, muse businesses, remote work negotiation, mini retirements, and the deeper philosophical question underneath all of it. What do you actually want to do with the life you've reclaimed? Before we move further into the elimination section, it's worth slowing down on something Ferriss touches on throughout these chapters that often gets overlooked in summaries of this book: the psychology of why smart, driven people resist cutting things. It's not usually laziness that keeps people overloaded. It's identity. Many high achievers have built their sense of self around their capacity to handle more than other people. Being the person who responds to every email, attends every meeting, says yes to every opportunity, and never drops a ball, that's not just a work style. For a lot of people, it's who they are. Removing tasks doesn't just free up time. It threatens something they've been using their schedule to prove. Ferriss doesn't psychologize this at great length, but it runs underneath everything in this section. The low-information diet isn't just about productivity. It's about withdrawing from a kind of busyness addiction that many people don't recognize as an addiction because everyone around them has it too. He also makes a point about selective ignorance that's worth holding on to. There is an enormous amount of information in the world that you could know that won't change a single decision you make in the next year. Most news falls into this category. Most of what fills your inbox on a given day falls into this category. The discipline isn't in consuming it faster. It's in choosing not to consume it at all, and directing that attention toward the narrow slice of things that actually move your life forward. He gives a telling example from his own practice. For a period he committed to reading no newspapers, watching no television news, and getting updates only through targeted sources. He discovered something most media-saturated people find hard to believe. Almost nothing changed in how well he understood the world that affected his decisions. He was better rested, clearer-headed, and no less capable of navigating his life. This is a genuinely controversial position, and he knows it. There are real arguments for being an informed citizen. There are real costs to selective ignorance in domains where awareness matters. We'll address those honestly in Part 2, where we take a full look at the book's limitations. But the core insight is worth separating from the controversial packaging. Most people consume information the way they eat at a buffet, not because they are hungry, but because it's there and because stopping feels like missing something. The discipline of deciding in advance what information is actually worth your attention is one of the most underrated cognitive skills a professional can develop. He rounds out the elimination section with a practical look at interruption management. The biggest threat to your most important work isn't big dramatic crises. It's the accumulation of small interruptions. The tap on the shoulder, the notification, the quick question that takes 15 minutes, the meeting that replaces a block of deep focus you were never going to get back. Ferriss recommends batching communications, screening calls, and training the people around you to solve problems without you whenever possible. Not out of aloofness, but out of respect for the quality of attention that complex work actually requires. There is a version of this advice that sounds antisocial, and it's worth acknowledging that. The goal isn't to become unreachable or to treat other people's needs as inconveniences. It's to protect enough uninterrupted time that when you are present, in a conversation, in a meeting, on a call, you're actually there. The irony of constant availability is that it often makes you less present everywhere, not more. He also draws a distinction between being responsive and being reactive. Responsive means you return communications thoughtfully, at a time you've chosen. Reactive means you let every incoming message dictate your next action. Responsive people tend to get more done and produce better work. Reactive people tend to feel busier while advancing less. Taken together, definition and elimination form the philosophical and analytical foundation of the book. Before you automate anything, before you hire anyone, before you change where you live or how you work, Ferriss wants you to be honest about what you want and ruthlessly clear about what's actually standing in the way. Most people never do either of these things with any real rigor. They add tools, add systems, add staff, add commitments, and wonder why the pressure doesn't ease. The answer, in Ferriss's view, is almost always the same. They skip the subtraction. Define clearly. Eliminate ruthlessly. Then, and only then, do you have something worth automating and a life worth liberating. Part 2 will take us into exactly that. Let's pause before we close Part 1 tonight and look at something the book does that's easy to miss in the flow of all its practical advice. Ferriss frames the entire deal framework around a single underlying argument, that most people are living on a deferred timeline. They are working toward a future version of their life, the one that starts after the promotion, after the mortgage is paid, after the kids are grown, after retirement, and in the meantime, they're tolerating a present they wouldn't consciously choose. He calls this the deferred life plan. And he argues that it contains a dangerous assumption, that the future version of you will definitely arrive, will be healthy and energetic enough to enjoy what you've saved for, and will actually want what you've been deferring toward all along. None of those things are guaranteed. And the cost of the plan isn't just the risk that it fails. It's the certain loss of the years you spent waiting. This is the deepest idea in the book, and it's one that shows up repeatedly in great writing on time and meaning. It doesn't require you to quit your job or leave for South America to take seriously. It just requires honest reckoning with the question, am I actually building toward what I want, or am I accumulating evidence that I'm working hard while avoiding that question? Ferriss is at his best when he's asking that question. He's less careful when he's answering it for you, but the question itself is worth sitting with for a long time. Now, a genuine takeaway from tonight that you can carry into tomorrow. The 80-20 analysis isn't just for business owners. It applies to anyone who has more commitments than energy. Pick one domain, your work, your relationships, your time outside of work, and ask, what 20% of activities here is producing 80% of the results, the meaning, the satisfaction? And what 80% is filling space without contributing much? You don't have to act on the answer immediately, but having the answer changes how you see your choices. And that's often how real change begins, not with a dramatic decision, but with a question you've been honest enough to ask. One more thing worth naming before we close tonight, the book's honest acknowledgement that being busy is often a form of avoidance. When your schedule is completely full, you never have to confront the more uncomfortable question of what you do with genuine freedom. Busyness is socially acceptable. It's even admired. And it's one of the most effective ways to avoid the slightly terrifying work of figuring out what you actually care about. Ferriss isn't saying you're secretly lazy. He's saying that for many driven people, the obstacle to a better life isn't a lack of effort. It's a surplus of activity that crowds out the reflection required to direct that effort somewhere meaningful. That's a more uncomfortable critique than it might sound. but it's also one of the most useful things this book has to offer. Tonight we covered who Tim Ferriss is and where this book came from. We walked through the deal framework and went deep on the first two phases: definition, getting honest about what you actually want, calculating the real cost of your dreams, and using fear setting to see past the obstacles you've been inflating, and elimination, applying the 80-20 principle and Parkinson's law to ruthlessly cut what doesn't matter, putting yourself on a low-information diet, and learning to protect your attention the way you'd protect any other finite resource. In Part 2, we'll move into automation and liberation, the mechanics of building systems that run without you, the case for virtual assistants and the Muse business, geo-arbitrage, mini-retirements, and the deeper philosophical question that underlies it all. We'll also take an honest look at where this book falls short, who it's not really written for, and how it compares to two other books that approach the same territory from very different angles. Until then, let the questions from tonight rest quietly. You don't have to solve anything before sleep. So as you drift off tonight, carry this with you, not as a task, just as a quiet thought. Think about the shape of your average week, the things that fill it, the things you do almost automatically, without asking whether they belong there. And ask yourself, honestly, if you could only do 3 of those things tomorrow, just 3, which 3 would you choose? Everything else, for one day, would simply not happen. What would that feel like? What would it free up? What might you do with the afternoon that opened? You don't have to answer tonight. Just let the question float there as you fall asleep. Sometimes the most useful thinking happens when we stop trying to think. Part 2 is ready when you are. We'll meet you there. Sleep well. And we'll see you at Whispering Pages for the next one.